The wind, a ceaseless tormentor, scoured the vast, unforgiving plains of the Montana Territory, carrying with it the grit of 1,000 barren miles and the mournful sigh of an endless sky. It whipped Ilara's thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, a flimsy defense against the encroaching chill of an autumn that promised a brutal winter. The stagecoach, a bone-jarring cage of wood and worn leather, had deposited her hours ago at the desolate crossroads, a mere speck against the immensity of the landscape. Now, a rough-hewn wagon, driven by a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh sun and harder seasons, conveyed her towards an unknown fate. Each jolt sent a fresh wave of despair through her, a cold counterpoint to the feverish anxiety that had been her constant companion for weeks. She was a parcel, delivered against her will, yet with a consent born of utter desperation. The letter, clutched in her numb fingers inside a threadbare reticule, had spoken of a Mr. Silas Blackwood, a cattle baron of considerable means, seeking a wife. It had been penned by her late father's cousin, a man she barely knew, a man who had seen in her plight an opportunity to unburden himself of a distant, orphaned relative. The description of the prospective bride, she knew, had been a careful construction of half-truths and outright fabrications, painting a picture of a mature woman, capable, perhaps even a widow herself, seeking companionship and a comfortable home. Ilara was none of these things. At 17, with the bloom of youth barely settled on her cheeks, she was a child in a woman's dress, her eyes holding the haunted look of one who had witnessed too much loss, too much sorrow. The truth of her age, her innocence, her utter lack of worldly experience, this was the unspoken cargo she carried, a secret that felt as heavy as the mountains looming in the distance. The air grew colder as the sun dipped lower, painting the bruised sky in strokes of violent orange and purple. The man beside her, a ranch hand named Jeb, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since they'd left the crossroads. His silence was a heavy blanket, smothering the questions that clawed at her throat. What manner of man was this Silas Blackwood? Would he be cruel? Would he see the deception at once and cast her out into this wilderness? The thought sent a tremor through her that had little to do with the cold. Her stomach twisted with a hunger that was more fear than a need for sustenance. She could taste the dust on her tongue, feel its grittiness in her eyes, her hair. The scent of sagebrush and dry earth filled her nostrils, a perfume of desolation. This was to be her new life, a life purchased with a lie. The stakes were impossibly high, there was no home to return to, no family to receive her if she failed. Only the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory, and the slow, certain demise it offered to the unprepared and the unwanted. The despair was a living thing, coiling in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She pressed her lips together, a small, determined line in her pale face, fighting back the tears that threatened to betray her youth and her terror. She had to be strong, or at least appear to be. It was the only currency she possessed. The wagon crested a small rise, and below, nestled in a shallow valley, lay the Blackwood Ranch. It was not a grand manor, but a sprawling collection of sturdy, dark log buildings, dominated by a large, two-story house with a wide, unwelcoming porch. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a solitary sign of life in the gathering gloom. It looked more like a fortress than a home. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The end of the journey, the beginning of an ordeal. The wind seemed to keen her name, a lament for the girl she had been, and a grim welcome to the woman she would be forced to become. The wagon creaked to a halt before the main house, the silence that descended amplifying the thudding of Ilara's heart. Jeb grunted, climbing down and gesturing curtly towards the imposing structure. "He's likely in his study. West side." He then turned to unhitch the horses, his duty seemingly done, offering no further guidance or reassurance. Ilara hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the wagon bed. The house loomed, its windows dark eyes staring out at her, assessing, judging. Taking a shaky breath, she gathered her meager courage and climbed down, her legs stiff and unsteady from the long journey. Her worn valise, containing all her worldly possessions, felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The porch steps groaned under her slight weight, each sound an indictment. Reaching the heavy oak door, she paused, her knuckles hovering before the wood. What if he was a monster? What if the kindness implied in seeking a wife, even an older one for companionship, was a facade? The letter from her cousin had been sparse on details about Mr. Blackwood himself, focusing more on his wealth and the supposed suitability of the match for a woman of experience. A woman like the one Elara was pretending to be. She forced herself to knock, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness. Silence. Then, the distinct thud of heavy footsteps from within. The door swung inward, revealing not the stooped, elderly gentleman she had vaguely, perhaps foolishly, hoped for, but a man who seemed carved from the very rock of the surrounding mountains. Silas Blackwood was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, though his face, weathered and stern, bore the lines of a man who had lived hard but was far from old. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed almost imperceptibly as they took her in, sweeping from her too youthful face down to her simple, travel-stained dress. There was no welcome in his gaze, only a profound, unsettling stillness. Elara felt a blush creep up her neck, a betraying heat. She could see the surprise, the flicker of something else. Disappointment? Annoyance? He had been expecting someone else entirely. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Mr. Blackwood, she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper, far too young, far too timid for the mature, capable woman he had been led to anticipate. He did not speak immediately, his gaze unwavering, making her feel like an insect pinned beneath a lens. "You are the woman sent by Thomas Albright." His voice was deep, gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It held no warmth, only a flat, questioning tone. "Yes, sir." Elara Vance. She offered her name, a fragile token. He looked her over again, slowly, deliberately. The air crackled with unspoken thoughts, with the vast chasm between his expectation and her reality. She could almost hear her cousin's duplicitous words echoing in the space between them, the carefully crafted lies about her age, her skills, her suitability. Albright's letter, it painted a different picture. His words were not an accusation, merely a statement of fact, yet they landed like blows. Elara's carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. She could only nod, her throat tight. What could she say? Confess the deception now, at the very threshold of her last hope? Or try to maintain the charade, however poorly? A woman entered the hall from a passage behind him, older, with a severe face and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain her features. Her eyes, sharp and bird-like, took in Elara with an expression that mirrored Blackwood's initial surprise, quickly followed by a distinct disapproval. This, Elara surmised, must be Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper her cousin had mentioned only in passing as efficient. "Show Miss Vance to the east guest room, Martha," Blackwood said, his tone clipped, turning slightly towards the housekeeper but his eyes still lingering on Elara for a moment longer. "Supper is at 7. It was a dismissal. Not unkind, perhaps, but utterly devoid of welcome. He stepped back, allowing Mrs. Croft to usher her inside, his presence filling the doorway, a formidable barrier. As Elara passed him, she caught the faint scent of wood smoke, leather, and the outdoors, a scent as rugged and uncompromising as the man himself. The hall was dark, panelled in heavy wood, sparsely furnished. It felt cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. The weight of the lie, of her desperate situation, pressed down on her, heavier than ever. The shocking truth of her youth, her vulnerability, was now out, plain for him to see, even if unspoken. His reaction had been unreadable, a blank wall of stoicism. But she had seen the discrepancy register, the silent acknowledgement of a profound mismatch. Her future here felt as precarious as a cliff edge in the howling wind. The east guest room was larger than any room Elara had ever occupied, yet it felt like a gilded cage. Heavy damask curtains, the color of dried blood, blocked out what little light remained of the day, and the massive, four-poster bed seemed to swallow her whole when she finally, tentatively, sat upon its edge. Mrs. Croft had deposited her valise with a sniff, her disapproval a palpable force in the chilly air. "Mr. Blackwood prefers punctuality at meals. 7 sharp, she had stated, her voice as starched as her apron, before leaving Elara to the echoing silence. Alone, the carefully constructed dam of Elara's composure finally broke. Silent tears tracked through the grime on her cheeks. She was an impostor, a fraud. Thomas Albright had not just misrepresented her, he had, in essence, sold her under false pretenses. He had likely used an old description, perhaps of a distant aunt, or simply invented a persona he thought a man like Blackwood would desire. And Mr. Blackwood, a man of obvious substance and command, would surely not tolerate such a deception for long. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, listening. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside, every distant call of a night bird, amplified her sense of isolation. She rose and walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain. The view was of the rolling, shadowed hills, now fading into the deep indigo of twilight. A few lights flickered from the bunkhouse and outbuildings, distant and separate. This was his kingdom, a vast, rugged domain, and she was an unwelcome, ill-fitting piece. She wondered about the woman he had expected. Someone his own age, perhaps, with a shared understanding of the world, capable of managing a household of this size, of being a companion in truth. Not a girl barely out of childhood, whose only skills were a neat hand at mending and a quiet endurance learned through grief and hardship. Her father, a gentle scholar, had left her nothing but debts and a few cherished books. Her mother had faded long ago. Cousin Albright had been her last resort. The thought of being sent away, cast out into the biting wind with nowhere to go, was a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. She had to find a way, any way, to prove her worth, to make herself useful, if only to earn her keep until what? There was no other prospect. Supper was a strained, silent affair. Elara, having washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher in her room and changed into her only other presentable dress, a drab grey wool that did little to enhance her appearance or suggest maturity, found herself seated opposite Mr. Blackwood at a long, polished mahogany table. Mrs. Croft served them, her movements efficient and disapproving. The food was simple but plentiful, roasted meat, potatoes, gravy, and coarse bread, but Elara found it difficult to swallow. Mr. Blackwood ate with a focused intensity, rarely looking up. When his gaze did meet hers, it was brief, unreadable, making her skin prickle. She tried to eat slowly, to mimic a composure she did not feel. The silence in the dining room was broken only by the clink of cutlery against china. She observed him covertly when she dared. His hands were large, calloused, the hands of a man who worked, despite his apparent wealth. There was a weariness about his eyes, a deep-set sadness that his stern demeanor couldn't entirely conceal. Was he lonely? Was that why he had sought a wife, even through such an impersonal arrangement? Or was it merely for convenience, for the societal expectation of a man of his standing? The question swirled in her mind, offering no comfort. After the meal, he spoke, his voice startling her. Albright will answer for this discrepancy. It was not directed at her, but more a thought spoken aloud, heavy with implication. He rose. Mrs. Croft will see to your needs. I have work. And then he was gone, leaving Elara alone once more at the vast table, the remnants of the meal growing cold before her. His words, though not an outright condemnation of her, offered no solace. He was displeased, and the source of that displeasure was the lie that had brought her here. She was the discrepancy. The weight of this truth, the shocking disparity between what was promised and what was delivered, felt like a physical burden, crushing her spirit. She spent the evening in her room, the unopened valise a symbol of her uncertain tenure. The wind howled outside, a soundtrack to her fear. Sleep was elusive, her mind replaying the scene of her arrival, Mr. Blackwood's searching eyes, the stark realization of the deception. She was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, the shores of safety impossibly distant. Days bled into a week, each one a careful navigation of the vast, quiet house and the even vaster, more intimidating presence of Silas Blackwood. Elara existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a judgment that never seemed to come. She saw him mostly at meals, which remained largely silent affairs. His pronouncement about holding Thomas Albright accountable hung in the air, an unspoken threat that kept her perpetually on edge. She learned to make herself small, to move through the house like a ghost, terrified of causing any offense, of giving him further reason to regret her presence. Mrs. Croft remained a bastion of thinly veiled disapproval, her instructions curt, her scrutiny constant. Elara attempted to make herself useful, offering to help with mending or light kitchen duties, but the housekeeper rebuffed her with a firm, "Mr. Blackwood has staff for that." It was clear she was not considered part of that staff, nor, it seemed, was she considered the lady of the house. She was an anomaly, an uncomfortable presence that disrupted the established order. Elara spent hours in her room, staring out at the relentless landscape, or wandering the few downstairs rooms she felt permitted to enter, the formal parlor, always cold and unused, and the small library, filled with books on animal husbandry, ledgers, and surprisingly, a few volumes of poetry, their pages well thumbed. It was in the library, one blustery afternoon, that she first saw a different side of Silas Blackwood, or perhaps, a glimpse beneath the granite exterior. She had thought herself alone, seeking refuge from Mrs. Croft's pointed sighs, when he entered, not noticing her immediately in the dim light by the far window. He went to a shelf, pulled down a slender volume, and for a moment, his harsh features softened as he ran a calloused thumb over the worn leather cover. He didn't open it, but stood there, lost in thought, a profound loneliness emanating from him that resonated with her own. The moment was fleeting. He looked up, his eyes finding hers, and the mask of stoic indifference snapped back into place. He merely nodded curtly and left the room, the book still in his hand. But the image remained with Elara, a tiny ember of curiosity in the cold landscape of her fear. What sorrows did he carry? What dreams had been weathered away by this harsh land and a life she could only guess at? She began to observe him more closely, not with the fearful anxiety of a condemned prisoner, but with a dawning, hesitant understanding. She saw the way his men respected him, their interactions brief but based on an unspoken accord. She saw the genuine concern in his eyes when a prized bull took ill, the long hours he spent in the stables, his sleeves rolled up, working alongside his veterinarian. He was a man of the land, tied to it, responsible for it, and for all who depended on it. This was not a cruel man, she began to suspect, but a man burdened by responsibility, perhaps by past griefs that had hardened him. The shocking truth of her own arrival, the deception perpetrated by her cousin, still lay between them like a raw wound. He had not spoken of it again since that first night, but Elara felt it in every interaction, every prolonged silence. She knew he was waiting, perhaps, for a letter from Albright, for an explanation, before deciding her fate. The harshness of the Montana environment was a constant teacher. The wind never seemed to cease, the nights grew increasingly frigid, and the very air tasted of an impending winter that everyone spoke of with a grim respect. Elara, accustomed to the softer climes of her former life, struggled. Her thin dresses were inadequate, her hands often chapped and raw from the dry air. She tried to learn by watching, observing how Mrs. Croft managed the household stores, how the ranch hands prepared for the changing season. Small attempts to contribute, like ensuring the wood box by the parlor fireplace was full, were met with Mrs. Croft's tightened lips, though no direct rebuke. Elara felt the societal judgment acutely, even if it was largely unspoken within the confines of the ranch house. She was the young, unexpected bride, the subject of Blackwood's silent displeasure, an object of the housekeeper's scorn. The weight of being out of place, of being a living, breathing mistake, was a constant ache. Yet, a tiny seed of resilience, long dormant, began to sprout. She would not simply wither here. She would endure. A subtle shift began, almost imperceptible, like the first thawing of a frozen stream. It wasn't in words, for words remained a scarce commodity in the Blackwood household, but in small, unacknowledged gestures. One morning, Elara found a thick, woolen shawl draped over the back of her chair at breakfast. It was a deep forest green, simply made but incredibly warm. Her eyes flew to Mr. Blackwood, but his attention was fixed on his plate. Mrs. Croft offered no explanation, her expression as impassive as ever. Elara murmured a hesitant, "Thank you," to the room at large, and when she wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, the warmth was a small comfort against more than just the morning chill. Another day, struggling to reach a tin of tea from a high shelf in the pantry, a rare foray she dared in Mrs. Croft's absence, a large hand reached past her, easily retrieving it. Silas Blackwood simply placed it on the counter beside her and walked away without a word, leaving her flustered but with a strange flutter in her chest that wasn't entirely fear. He had been in the adjoining kitchen, overseeing the butchering accounts with the cook, and must have seen her difficulty. He hadn't commented on her presence in the pantry, nor on her clumsiness. He had just helped. Elara, in turn, began to find small ways to bridge the chasm of silence and expectation. She noticed he often squinted at the ledgers in the dim evening light of his study. Without asking, she began ensuring the oil lamp on his desk was always freshly trimmed and filled, its chimney polished to a bright gleam. She would leave it lit for him if she knew he was working late with the foreman. He never acknowledged this service, but she noticed he stopped squinting quite so much. The vast, empty spaces of the house became less daunting as she established these tiny routines. She learned the rhythms of the ranch from a distance, the early morning departure of the cowhands, the midday meal bell, the return of the men at dusk, tired but with a rough camaraderie. She saw Silas overseeing it all, a constant, steady presence. The shocking truth of her arrival, her youth, the deceit of her guardians, still hung between them, an unspoken topic. She knew he had dispatched a stern letter to Thomas Albright weeks ago. The ranch hand who carried the mail to the distant stage post had said as much to the cook, words Elara had unintentionally overheard. The reply, if one ever came, would likely seal her fate. Yet, as the days passed and no judgment was rendered, a fragile hope began to take root. Perhaps he saw not just the deception, but the desperation that had driven her to accept this arrangement, however flawed. One afternoon, a fierce early autumn storm blew in, the wind howling like a banshee, driving sheets of icy rain against the windows. Elara was in the library, seeking solace in the quiet company of books, when a particularly violent gust rattled the shutters. A section of the heavy drapes had come loose from its mooring and was flapping wildly. Before she could react, Silas Blackwood was there, having entered silently. He moved to the window, his powerful frame easily wrestling the heavy fabric and errant shutter back into place, securing them against the storm's fury. He turned, and for a moment, their eyes met. The storm outside seemed to mirror an unspoken turbulence within the room. "This weather," he said, his voice low, "it tests everything." It was the most personal observation he had yet offered her. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It does." He lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, concern. Or merely an assessment of her resilience against the metaphorical storms as well as the literal one. Then, he was gone, leaving her with the sound of the wind and the faint, lingering scent of damp wool and earth. These small moments, these shared observations of the harsh land they both inhabited, began to weave a delicate, almost invisible thread between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet, and certainly not the comfortable companionship he had likely envisioned with an older bride. But it was something. A nascent understanding, perhaps, born from shared solitude and the silent acknowledgement of each other's presence in this vast, demanding world. The lie about her age and experience was still there, a shadow in the corner of every room, but its edges were, perhaps, beginning to soften, just a little. The fragile truce of unspoken understandings was shattered by the arrival of Phineas Cole. He rode in one crisp morning, not on a workhorse like Blackwood's men, but on a sleek, showy gelding, his attire more suited to a town dandy than a working ranch. Cole was a neighboring rancher, though his holdings were smaller and his reputation, Elara had gleaned from overheard kitchen gossip, was less than sterling. He was known for his sharp dealings and a grasping ambition that often overstepped the bounds of neighborly conduct. Silas met him on the porch, his stance immediately wary, his face hardening into the granite lines Elara had first encountered. She watched from the parlor window, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Cole's voice, oily and too loud, carried easily. "Blackwood! Heard you'd taken yourself a wife. Thought I'd come by and offer my felicitations. And, well, see the lucky lady for myself." His eyes, small and cunning, raked over Elara when Silas, with a stiff, reluctant gesture, indicated her presence in the doorway. Cole's gaze lingered, overtly appraising, and a smirk played on his lips. "Well now, Blackwood. Albright's letter mentioned I'm a woman. Seems he sent you a spring lamb instead of old mutton, eh?" His laughter was coarse, grating. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a hot wave of shame and anger. Silas's hand clenched at his side. "My affairs are my own, Cole. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Just making an observation, neighbor. A man your age, with a child bride. Tongues will wag, you know. Some might say you've robbed the cradle. Others might wonder if the girl's family weren't desperate to offload her." Each word was a calculated barb, designed to demean both her and Silas. Ilara wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but she forced herself to stand tall, to meet Cole's leering gaze with as much dignity as she could muster, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The societal judgment, which had been a subtle undercurrent, was now stark and brutal, voiced by this unpleasant man. Silas stepped slightly forward, positioning himself subtly between Ilara and Cole. "What do you want, Cole?" "Just a friendly visit. And perhaps to discuss that south pasture again. The one bordering my land. Seems to me, with a new family to consider, you might be looking to consolidate, perhaps sell off a parcel you don't strictly need." Greed glittered in Cole's eyes. So this was the true purpose of his visit, to exploit what he perceived as a weakness, a distraction, a potential scandal. Ilara saw a muscle jump in Silas's jaw. "The south pasture is not for sale. Not now, not ever. And my wife," he said the word with a surprising firmness, his eyes briefly meeting Ilara's, "is not a topic for discussion." The possessive pronoun, the unexpected defense, sent a small shockwave through Ilara. He had called her his wife. "Not the woman Albright sent, awed Miss Vance, but my wife." Cole's smirk faltered for a moment, then returned, uglier than before. "Protective, are we? Well, enjoy your spring lamb, Blackwood. Just hope she's worth the trouble she's bound to bring." He tipped his hat with an insolent flourish, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of ill will in his wake. The silence that descended was thick with unspoken tension. Ilara could feel Silas's anger, a palpable force. She didn't know what to say, what to do. The confrontation had laid bare the precariousness of her position, the judgment of the outside world. Silas turned, his face a mask of controlled fury. He looked at Ilara, his expression unreadable but intense. For a moment, she thought he might finally voice the condemnation she had been dreading, that Cole's words had given him the impetus to cast her out. Instead, he simply said, his voice rough, "Go inside." It was an order, but not an unkind one. It felt protective. As she retreated into the house, her legs trembling, she understood that Phineas Cole was more than just an unpleasant neighbor. He was an external threat, a manifestation of the cruelty and greed that could shatter the fragile peace she had begun to find. And Silas Blackwood, in his quiet, formidable way, had just stood between her and that threat. The unspoken truth of her identity was still a chasm, but for the first time, it felt as though they might be standing on the same side of it, facing a common enemy. The visit from Phineas Cole cast a long shadow. His insinuations lingered in the air, a poisonous residue. Ilara found herself more withdrawn, the shame Cole had ignited burning beneath her calm facade. She waited for Silas to speak of it, to demand an explanation for the clear deception Cole had so cruelly highlighted. But he remained silent on the matter, his demeanor perhaps a fraction more remote, his thoughts hidden behind that familiar wall of stoicism. The letter from Thomas Albright, or the lack of one, became an even more potent source of anxiety for Ilara. Had her cousin even bothered to reply to Silas's stern missive? Or had he simply washed his hands of her, content to have her off his conscience, regardless of the consequences she now faced? One evening, as a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within her, Ilara found she could bear the silence no longer. Silas was in his study, the door slightly ajar, the light from his lamp spilling into the darkened hallway. She could hear the scratch of his pen, the rustle of papers. Taking a deep breath, a small, desperate prayer on her lips, she knocked softly. "Enter." His voice was deep, unsurprised. He looked up as she stepped into the room, his eyes questioning. The study was his sanctuary, filled with the scent of old paper, leather, and distant wood smoke. Maps of his vast holdings covered one wall. It was a room that spoke of power, of responsibility, of a life lived with purpose. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. I need to speak with you. About Mr. Cole. About why I am here. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, waiting. The silence stretched, amplifying the frantic beat of her heart. My cousin, Thomas Albright, he was not entirely truthful in his correspondence with you. It was a monumental understatement. He led you to believe I was older. More capable. A widow, perhaps. Silas's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker deep in his eyes. Acknowledgement. I am only 17, sir. My parents are gone. I had nowhere else. He thought this would be a solution. The words tumbled out, a torrent of confession. He sent a description that was not mine. Perhaps an old aunt's, or one he invented. I did not know the full extent of his deceit until I read your copy of his letter, the one Mrs. Croft inadvertently left in the parlor some weeks ago. I knew he was seeking a position for me, but the specifics of the arrangement, he made them sound like a respectable companionship. She faltered, the shame of it all washing over her. I am not what you wanted. What you were promised. I understand if you wish to send me away. I have no right to be here under such false pretenses. There. It was said. The shocking truth, her greatest fear, laid bare before him. She braced herself for his anger, for his dismissal. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. The storm outside seemed to punctuate the tension, a wild gust of wind rattling the window panes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of the fury she had expected. 17. He said the word softly, as if tasting its implications. A child, then. Sent out to this. He gestured vaguely towards the window, towards the harsh, unforgiving land beyond. There was no condemnation in his tone, but something else, like a weariness, a profound understanding of the cruelty of the world. Albright described a woman of 35. Experienced in managing a large household. A companion for a man, set in his ways. His gaze was distant for a moment, as if seeing the ghost of the woman he had anticipated. Ilara's heart sank. The contrast between that capable, mature figure and her own youthful inadequacy was stark. I can learn, sir, she whispered, a desperate plea. I can work. I don't expect. I only wish to earn my keep. Not to be a burden. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she thought she saw past the stoic cattle baron to the man beneath. There was a flicker of something akin to sympathy, or perhaps just a reluctant acknowledgement of her desperate plight. A burden, he repeated slowly. Albright has made you a victim of his own expediency, girl. Not a burden of your own making. The words were unexpected. He wasn't blaming her. He was blaming Thomas Albright. The relief that washed over Ilara was so profound it almost buckled her knees. She hadn't realized how heavily the guilt had weighed upon her until this moment. He had seen her vulnerability, the truth of her situation, and had not turned it against her. Silas Blackwood did not send her away. In the days following Ilara's confession, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the atmosphere of the ranch house. The unspoken tension surrounding her identity eased, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. He did not mention Thomas Albright again, nor the deception, but his interactions with Ilara, though still sparse, carried a different weight. There was less of the stern assessment and more of a quiet observation, perhaps even a grudging respect for her courage in confessing. Mrs. Croft, taking her cue from her employer, seemed to unbend slightly. Her pronouncements remained sharp, but Ilara began to notice small kindnesses, a warmer quilt left on her bed as the nights grew colder, a portion of freshly baked bread set aside for her. It was as if, with the truth revealed, Ilara was no longer an uncomfortable anomaly but a known quantity, a young woman in a difficult situation rather than a deceitful interloper. Silas began to assign her small tasks, real responsibilities. He asked her to organize the jumble of receipts and correspondence in his study, a task that required neatness and attention to detail, skills her father's scholarly influence had inadvertently provided. He showed her how to check the household inventories, explaining the importance of foresight in such an isolated place. He spoke to her not as a child, nor as the mature chatelaine he had expected, but as someone capable of learning, of contributing. Elara, in turn, threw herself into these duties with a quiet determination. She was meticulous with his papers, her handwriting clear and precise in the new ledger she started for household expenses. She listened intently to his explanations, asking hesitant but intelligent questions. She was proving her worth, not as a replacement for the wife he'd envisioned, but as Elara Vance, a young woman finding her footing in a harsh world. The shared moments, though still brief, became more frequent. Sometimes, when he returned late from the range, she would have a pot of fresh coffee waiting, or a tray with a simple meal set by the fire in his study if he'd missed supper. He would offer a gruff thank you, but his eyes would hold a different light, a hint of appreciation. One afternoon, he found her in the library, not with a ledger, but with one of the worn volumes of poetry. She flushed, expecting a reprimand for idleness, but he merely nodded. "My mother's," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She found solace in them. He didn't elaborate, but the shared confidence, the glimpse into his past, was a precious thing. It humanized him further, chipping away at the formidable exterior. The tentative trust that had begun to sprout before her confession now deepened. It was a quiet understanding, forged not in grand pronouncements or declarations, but in the daily rhythms of life, in shared tasks, and in the growing recognition of each other's true character. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, her innate intelligence. She saw his integrity, his deep sense of responsibility, and the lonely core beneath his stern facade. The shocking truth of her arrival had been a crisis, but it had also been a catalyst, stripping away pretense and forcing them both to confront reality. For Elara, it had been terrifying, but his unexpected response, his quiet acceptance and the gradual offering of responsibility had allowed her to begin to shed the role of the frightened imposter and step into her own nascent strength. She was no longer just waiting for judgment, she was actively building a place for herself, however small, in this formidable world. The vast Montana landscape still stretched out, immense and challenging, but it no longer felt quite so alien, quite so threatening. She was learning its language, its demands, and, with Silas Blackwood's quiet guidance, she was beginning to feel less like a castaway and more like someone who might, eventually, belong. The biting winds of late autumn carried the scent of snow and the distant, hungry howl of wolves. Trouble, when it came, arrived not with the subtlety of changing seasons, but with the brutal directness of Phineas Cole. Reports had been filtering in from smaller, outlying homesteads, fences cut, a few head of cattle gone missing, subtle acts of harassment that bore Cole's insidious hallmark. Silas grew more watchful, his brow perpetually furrowed, spending longer hours on the range with his men. Elara, too, felt the heightened tension, a prickling unease that settled over the ranch like a shroud. One evening, as Silas and most of his hands were miles away, checking on a northern pasture where some of the best breeding stock grazed, the attack came. It began with the terrified bellowing of cattle from a nearby holding pen, followed by shouts and the unmistakable crack of rifle fire. Mrs. Croft, her face pale but set, bolted the kitchen door. "Rustlers," she hissed, a usual severity replaced by a grim fear. "Cole's men, I'd wager." His groan bold. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Silas was gone. Only a skeleton crew remained at the main ranch, Jeb, the old hand who had first brought her here, 2 young cowpokes barely older than herself, and the cook. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. But then she saw the determination in Mrs. Croft's eyes, the way Jeb, despite his age, checked the load of his ancient rifle. This was their home, their livelihood, under attack. And it was, in a strange, unexpected way, her home now too. "The horses in the near corral," Elara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "They'll try for them first, after the pen cattle." It was an instinct, born from weeks of observing the ranch's layout, of listening to Silas's quiet instructions. Jeb nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of surprise at her quick assessment. "Aye, miss. And Mr. Blackwood's prize stallion is in the stable." Panic surged. "Not Vela," Silas's magnificent black stallion, his pride. The thought of Cole's men getting their hands on him was unbearable. "We have to protect the stable," Ilara insisted, her mind racing. She remembered Silas's gun rack in the study, the shark guns he kept for bird hunting, but also for defense. "Mrs. Croft, bolt all the doors and windows. Stay away from them. Jeb, you and the boys try to drive the rustlers from the cattle pens if you can, but don't take foolish risks." "I'll go to the stable." "Miss Vance, you can't," Mrs. Croft protested. "It's too dangerous." But Ilara was already moving. Adrenaline coursed through her, banishing fear. She raced to the study, her hand surprisingly steady as she took down a heavy shotgun. She'd seen Silas handle it, knew vaguely how it worked. It was a desperate measure, but valor was too important. The stable was a short distance from the house, the sounds of chaos, shouts, gunshots, the panicked whinnies of horses, growing louder. Darkness was falling fast, punctuated by the orange flashes of gunfire. She could see shadowy figures moving near the corral, their intent clear. Reaching the stable, she fumbled with the heavy bar on the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, Valor was stamping and snorting, his eyes wide with terror. "Easy, boy, easy," she murmured, her voice shaking despite her resolve, stroking his trembling neck. She had to get him out, away from the main conflict. But where? The back of the stable opened onto a small, fenced paddock that led towards the river and dense willow thickets. If she could get him there, he might be safe. Suddenly, the stable door burst open. Two rough-looking men, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light Ilara had left burning, stood silhouetted against the opening. One leered. "Well, what have we here?" "A pretty little bonus." Ilara raised the shotgun, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring. "Get out," she ordered, her voice far stronger than she felt. The man laughed. "Put that thing down, girlie, before you hurt yourself." He took a step forward. Ilara didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, the recoil slamming her back against the stall. She hadn't aimed at the man, but at the wall above his head. Splinters of wood flew. Both men flinched back, their bravado vanishing. "The next one won't miss," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. They stared at her, then at the smoking gun, then at each other. Muttering curses, they backed out of the stable and disappeared into the darkness, likely deciding a frightened girl with a shotgun wasn't worth the risk when there were easier pickings. Trembling violently, Ilara fumbled with Valor's lead rope. She had to move quickly. She led the terrified stallion out the back, into the paddock, urging him towards the relative safety of the willows. Just as they reached the cover of the trees, she heard the thunder of hooves. Silas! He and his men had returned, riding hard, their own guns blazing as they charged towards the rustlers still harassing the corral. The fight was fierce but short. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Blackwood's experienced hands, Cole's men broke and fled into the night, leaving behind a few injured cattle and a profound sense of violation. Silas, his face grim, dismounted, his eyes scanning the chaos. Then he saw her, emerging from the willows, Valor's lead rope still clutched in her hand, the heavy shotgun cradled in her other arm. He strode towards her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would be angry, that she had overstepped, endangered herself. Instead, he stopped before her, his gaze sweeping over her, noting the shotgun, the trembling of her hands, the smudge of gunpowder on her cheek. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently taking the shotgun from her grasp. "You're all right." His voice was rough, laced with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. She could only nod, reaction setting in, her legs suddenly weak. He looked towards the stable, then back at her. Jeb, hurrying over, exclaimed, "Mr. Blackwood, sir." "Miss Vance, she run off two of them from the stable." "Saved Valor, she did." "Fired that scattergun like a seasoned hand." Silas's eyes fixed on hers, a new light dawning in their stormy depths. It wasn't just surprise or relief. It was something more. respect, admiration. He had expected a mature companion, had received a frightened girl, and now, that girl had stood against armed men to protect what was his. What was, in a way, theirs. The immediate aftermath of the raid was a flurry of activity. Injured cattle were tended, fences mended, and a grim accounting was taken of the losses, which, thanks to the timely return of Silas and his men, and Ilara's unexpected stand at the stable, were far less severe than they might have been. Phineas Cole would not be so bold again soon. Silas Blackwood's retribution, when it came, would be swift and certain, though enacted within the rough bounds of frontier justice, not outright war. As dawn painted the eastern sky with bruised purples and soft greys, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. Ilara, cleaned of gunpowder and grime but still shaken, sat by the kitchen hearth, a mug of Mrs. Croft's strong, sweet coffee warming her hands. The housekeeper, her earlier fear replaced by a grudging admiration, had even patted Ilara's shoulder, an unprecedented gesture. Silas entered, his face etched with weariness but also a grim satisfaction. He had been out with his men, tracking Cole's raiders for a short distance, ensuring they were truly gone from his lands. He paused by the hearth, looking down at Ilara. The silence between them was different now, stripped of the last vestiges of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was a silence of shared experience, of a battle fought and, in its own way, won. "Jeb told me what you did," he said, his voice low. "You showed courage, Ilara. More than many men I know." The use of her first name, spoken with such gravity, resonated deep within her. It was an acknowledgement, a validation. "Valor is important to you, sir," she replied simply, looking into the flames. This place, it's starting to feel like," she hesitated, unable to voice the burgeoning feeling of belonging. He understood. He nodded, a rare, almost imperceptible softening around his mouth. "This land demands courage. From all of us." He pulled up a stool, an unspoken invitation to share the quiet moment. The vast mahogany dining table where they had once eaten in strained silence felt a world away. Here, by the warmth of the kitchen fire, with the scent of coffee and wood smoke in the air, a different kind of companionship was being forged. It wasn't the drawing-room society he might have once envisioned, nor the mature partnership with a woman of equal years. It was something rawer, more elemental, born of shared hardship and mutual respect. He had seen her vulnerability, the truth of her youth and the deception that had brought her to him. And now, she had seen his strength, his fierce protectiveness, but he too had witnessed hers, a quiet resilience that had blossomed into fierce bravery when tested. The shocking truth of her arrival had, in the end, been less about the deception and more about the unexpected character it had revealed in both of them. He, the stoic cattle baron, had found himself capable of a protective tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. She, the frightened girl, had discovered a core of steel she hadn't realized was there. The transformation was palpable. Ilara was no longer the timid, apologetic creature who had arrived weeks ago. She held herself with a newfound confidence, her gaze steady, her voice clear. She had faced down armed men, defended what mattered, and earned her place not through deceit or feminine wiles, but through raw courage and capability. Silas Blackwood looked at her, truly saw her, perhaps for the first time, not as a discrepancy or a spring lamb, but as a partner, in spirit if not yet in name, in the ongoing battle to cover life from this wild, beautiful, unforgiving land. The unspoken question of her future, of her right to be there, had been answered not by words, but by actions, in the heart of a crisis. In the quiet days that followed the raid, a new rhythm established itself on the Blackwood Ranch. The immediate threat from Phineas Cole had receded, though a watchful vigilance remained. But within the main house, the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The last vestiges of formality between Ilara and Silas had been burned away in the crucible of shared danger. He still called her Ilara, and she, after a hesitant start, began to call him Silas, the name feeling less like a presumption and more like a natural consequence of all they had weathered together. She no longer felt like an ill-fitting guest or a charity case. Her tasks were no longer mere assignments to test her abilities, but integral parts of the ranch's functioning. She managed the household accounts with an efficiency that surprised even Mrs. Croft, whose initial disapproval had morphed into a grudging, then genuine, respect. Ilara found a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to the ledgers, in ensuring the smooth running of the domestic side of the vast enterprise, freeing Silas to focus on the cattle and the land. He, in turn, began to solicit her opinion on matters beyond the household. He would speak of his plans for the winter, of concerns about water rights or new breeds of cattle, not necessarily seeking her advice, but thinking aloud, sharing the burdens of his responsibilities. And Ilara would listen, offering quiet, thoughtful observations that sometimes, surprisingly, held a kernel of wisdom he hadn't considered. Her youth, once a source of shame and misgiving, now seemed to offer a fresh perspective, an unjaded outlook that complemented his own experience-hardened pragmatism. One crisp afternoon, Silas found her not in the study or the kitchen, but standing on the rise overlooking the valley, the wind whipping her hair back from her face, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks. She wore the forest green shawl he had given her, a splash of color against the muted tones of the landscape. He came to stand beside her, the silence comfortable, familiar. "It's a harsh land," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "It takes much." Ilara nodded, her eyes still on the mountains. "But it gives, too," she replied softly. "Strength. A sense of what truly matters." He looked at her then, at the quiet confidence in her profile, the resilience that shone from her eyes. The girl who had arrived trembling and afraid was gone. In her place stood a woman, young still, but forged in the fires of adversity, possessing a spirit as vast and untamed as the territory itself. He remembered his initial shock, his deep disappointment at Albright's deception. He had expected a contemporary, a woman of experience to ease his solitude, to manage his home with practiced hands. He had received a child, an apparent burden. Yet, this girl, this Ilara, had proven to possess a different kind of strength, an inner fortitude that had met every challenge, including his own stern judgment, with a quiet courage that had ultimately disarmed him. The narrative that had begun with a lie, with a shocking disparity between expectation and reality, had slowly, inexorably, rewritten itself. It was no longer a story of deception, but of resilience. It was a testament to the human capacity for growth, for finding strength in the most unlikely circumstances, for forging connections in the barren soil of hardship. This was not the marriage of convenience he had envisioned, not the comfortable companionship of equals in age and experience. It was something else, something deeper, harder one. A partnership built on mutual respect, on shared dangers, on the slow, steady revelation of true character. The Montana Territory still stretched around them, vast and demanding, its beauty raw, its challenges unceasing. But now, Ilara Vance Blackwood, for she had, in her heart and in his, truly become that, faced it not as a frightened castaway, but as a woman who had found her home, her strength, and an unlikely partner in the stoic cattle baron who had, against all expectations, also found his. The wind still whispered across the plains, but now, it seemed to carry not a lament, but a promise of shared sunrises, of winters endured together, of a future as expansive and full of possibility as the endless sky above.